Okay, so let's look at types of political system. By now, we've already covered constitution, ideology, sovereignty, the definition of politics. Now we are looking at the different systems, okay? We know we have a Westminster system, but that Westminster system or the Westminster model is categorized, okay, under a type of system. Okay, so there are different types of systems that exist in the world today. Okay, as far as politics is concerned, so we are going to look at these different types of systems. So these types of political system will help you understand different countries around the world. So, like we always do, we always look at the objectives first and try and see the contents and answer the questions or the notions that is put forward by the objectives. So here on page 52, you have 3 objectives here. So upon completion of this unit, we should be able to explain Aristotle's system for classification of political system. Secondly, apply modern typologies to describe political systems, and we have to outline different types of political regimes in the modern world. Now let me just I won't go through the introduction. I believe you should go through the introduction your own time, but like I always do, I will go through specific discussions that is in line with the objectives here. So we'll start our discussion on page 53, and we look at Aristotle's modern typology. So, if you like to say, we have the prophets in the Bible, people like Moses, Elijah. In politics, we have our prophets as well. One of the very first prophets is this Greek philosopher, scholar here, Aristotle. Now, he comes up with his typology, or you can say criteria in which we can see or classify a kind of society that existed during his time. Now, his typology, okay, here, typology here. So his typology is based on the notion or 2 notions, and these notions are who rules and who benefits. Okay, so during this that period, Aristotle has observed that in a society or in a community, there are 2, you can say, different types of people: the rulers and the subordinates. Or in the question, if you want to analyze a society during that time, you will look at who rules and who benefits. So these are the 2 typologies, or these are the 2 notions that are essential in looking at any political communities during Aristotle's time, and also at present during our time as well. Now, in these 2 notions here, or 2 dimensions here, forms the basis of the study of types of political society or political system. Now let's look at these 2 dimensions or 2 notions here: who rules and who benefits. Okay, the first dimension here, and I'll read. The first dimension is the number of people involved in the task of government, okay, which represents the level of participation in a political system. So, the number of people who rules. Sometimes in a society you have a chief, okay, he is the sole ruler. Sometimes the chief shares his rulership between certain different tribes, let's say 5 different clans. So the rulership of that community is distributed between these 7 tribes, okay? But importantly, in order to understand the community, we have to ask the question, who rules? Okay? So this dimension is important, even in the present context today. If you look at the world politics today, if you look at different countries, you would first like to ask this question, who rules? Is it the president alone, or is it the Chinese Communist Party for that matter? Or is it the National Executive Council in Papua New Guinea? So that dimension here, okay, who rules? Now, the second dimension is whether rulers govern in the common interest. Okay, this is important. I want you all to highlight this. In the common interest that is genuine, or in their own interest that is perverted. Okay, highlight this because this will become important when we look further into Aristotle's classification of government. So he says that if a ruler rules in the best interest of the people, okay, those societies or communities, okay, that tend to be a genuine application of that dimension. But if the rulers do not, okay, rule in the best interest of the community or society, then that rulership is perverted. Meaning that they are not, okay, the rulership is not in the best interest of the community or the society. Now, upon this notion here, the second sentence, and I read, the idea is that political system is likely to be more stable when rulers govern in the long-term interest of the community rather than in the narrow interest of a particular group or themselves. Now, upon this typology here, okay, or upon these 2 dimensions here, we'll take a look at take a look at table 7.1. That table 7.1 sort of gives us a illustration on the classification of government using Aristotle's dimension. Okay, who rules, okay, and who benefits. So here in this first, let's say, line of table here, when it's a good rulership, okay, then that rulership tends to be genuine. When it's a bad rulership, then that rulership tends to be perverted. When it's good governance, the rulership, okay, or that governance tends to be genuine. Okay, when it's bad governance, then it's perverted according to Aristotle's classification here. Okay, so you have genuine and perverted. Now, who rules? Now, if there is one ruler, okay, if you look at one ruler, and if that rulership is genuine, okay, the genuine rulership tends to be kinship. Okay, we have our chieftaincy system. If it's perverted, then you have the notion of, okay, tyranny or tyranny. That is one man, let's say, the manipulation of use of force by one dictatorship, something like that. Okay? Commonly found in most authoritarian regimes. Remember? Okay? Okay. Secondly, if there's two, in a society, if there's two rulers, then if there's genuine in terms of its leadership, let's say leadership. Leadership makes sense. If there is genuine leadership on who rules, then that particular society tends to be an aristocracy. Okay, an aristocracy is commonly associated with kings and queens or the monarchy system. Okay, that was during, let's say, 16th, 17th, or 15th to late or early 19th century. Now, the pivot of this kind of rulership is what is called oligarchy. Oligarchy is when you have two, let's say, powerful rulers, who tends to be, have insurmountable power at end or at its disposal. Now, Aristotle had a critic for that when you're looking at three or more rulership. If there's three or more rulership, the genuine rulership of that is polity, and the pivoted is democracy. Now, Aristotle had a different idea of democracy. The initial democracy, not the representative democracy that we have today. The representative democracy is a product of the late 18th or early 18th century. But the earliest form of democracy, the democracy, forms the basis of that. So, in Aristotle's view, he says that if there is three or more, or democracy is the perverted view, meaning that how can, let's say, a representative democracy we have today is that you pick up or you choose a leader through your votes or through election and they represent you on the floor of parliament. The perverted form, or what Aristotle is talking about, in a Greek city-state, if you have about 4,000 people, then you expect that 4,000 people in parliament. Now you see the irony in having 4,000 people speaking on the floor of parliament. Who listens to who? Who dominates the discussion? Are there fair representation? So that's the critique by Aristotle. But here, importantly to mention here, Aristotle's classification forms the basis of the modern day classification of types of political system. So the modern day types of political system, is centered around this notion or these dimensions here. The two dimensions of who rules and who benefits. When the ruler or the leadership is good, then the benefit is, or there is genuine leadership throughout the society. If it's bad, it's perverted. So that is the classification, Aristotle's classification of types of political system during that time. Now let's move on to objective 2 and look at the modern typologies that is found on page 54. And I'll read the first sentence of the first paragraph here. There are a range of different typologies that are now used to classify modern governments. Reading 7, in your resource books, reading 7 discusses the three worlds typology which distinguish between capitalist, communist, and the developing world. okay, or the first world, the second world, and the third world. Okay, so the recent modern typology or modern classification tend to classify countries in terms of development or modernization. Those that are developed is called the first world. Those are developed, okay, but slightly underdeveloped are called the second world, and those are underdeveloped are called third world. Okay, so that classification is also being used today. Okay, when you read in the papers, you would come across that classification of third world countries. Okay, so now read. However, this distinction has collapsed into developed and developing world due to Eastern European Revolution of the 1989, and that led to the collapse of the Orthodox communist regimes and the acceleration of political liberalization and market reform around the world. So by 1989, the collapse of communist Russia, okay, also affected the classification of modern political system. Now you have first, second, third world. Now you, the types of classification now falls in either developed or developing world. Now let's look at the Hansen and Harab's distinguishing, or Hansen and Harab's regimes. Okay, Hansen and Harab's distinguish between established democracy, where democratic way is entrance, new democracy, and where older democratic traditions still exert influence and authoritarian regimes. Okay, so modern classification tend to be more dictated by development, but Hansen and Harab's view of typology of classification, okay, presents another, okay, another, let's say, you can say dimension or notions, okay, in the political view. And here, now Hansen and Harab's typology for classifying modern governments, okay, it classifies the modern governments into three items or three forms here. And let's go through these three forms here. Number one, governments could be classified according to their relationship between the state and the society in which they are based. Now, Harab's view, he says that government's classification can be viewed through the state and the state and the society. So Hansen and Harab's view also holds that same dimension of Aristotle's classical classification of who rules and who benefits. But here, he looks at it at the state level and the society level. So in our country, we have at the state level, the government, and the society level, the citizens. So, and the second sentence, so the three types in this dimension can be liberal democratic, totalitarian, and authoritarian. So liberal democracy is, okay, like Papua New Guinea, most of the Western European democracies, we are a liberal democratic country. Okay, we have elections or continuous elections. Okay, that is where you will have countries that goes through regular continuous elections. Okay, are countries that are categorized under this liberal democratic view. And then you have totalitarian countries. Totalitarian countries are countries that are under, okay, you can say, one man or dictatorship. An example of this would be North Korea. And then you have authoritarian countries. Authoritarian countries are countries that are ruled by one or two groups. A good notable example would be China. China is an authoritarian state. The Chinese Communist Party is in charge of China. Now Xi Jinping is the president of the Chinese Communist Party. So you would see the Hansen and Harab's first notion here, relationship between the state and the society. The state can be either a liberal democratic state, a totalitarian state, or an authoritarian state. Now let's look at number 2. So secondly, governments could then be classified according to the relationship between the executive and the legislative powers of the government. Okay? The chief distinction in this dimension can be between parliamentary and presidential system. Now in democracy again, you have two different types of relationship between who rules and who benefits, if you're going to use Aristotle's typologies. Now, in this second dimension here, or second notion here, okay, who rules in the parliamentary system? Okay, the executive, who tends to have more power over the legislature, as in Papua New Guinea. Okay, so in a parliamentary system, you have the prime minister and his executive members who are taken from the legislature. So the relationship between the executive government and the legislature. Now, in the presidential system, the president itself is an independent, let's say, and has autonomy, and the legislature or the executive government is not picked, or he does not choose his cabinet or executive government from the legislature. President Trump doesn't look at the Congress and picks up people from within the Congress. His executive government are top, let's say, public bureaucrats, or even someone from outside the bureaucracy. So in a presidential system, you won't see a president picking someone from within the legislature. If he's going to pick someone within the legislature, for example, in the United States, you have the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, I believe. He was a former senator. So he had to resign, withdraw from his position as someone from the Congress to take up the position of the Secretary of State. So in presidential system, you don't have the president picking or choosing people from the legislature. That's the difference. So Hansen and Harab's classification he says that in democracy, you have difference between relationship between the executive and the legislature. Okay, you have prime minister system or the Westminster system. The prime minister is chosen within the legislature. In the presidential system, the prime minister is voted directly outside of the legislature. Okay, let's look at number 3. Finally, governments could be classified according to their degree of centralization or decentralization. Major types in this dimension could be the unitary state or the devolved state, the federal state or the confederation. Centralization and decentralization is a significant issue for large modern states, although it is not relevant to Aristotle, who was considering small governments that were the size of the large city. Okay, the last sentence here basically talked about what Aristotle was talking about is that his form of democracy is not practiced today. So it does not fit this classification here. But importantly, in a totalitarian or authoritarian state, you would have centralization of power, meaning that the state or the government controls most of the functions of service delivery. Okay? When it comes to self-service delivery, the central government usually takes charge of that. You don't have that in most of the liberal democratic countries. So in Papua New Guinea, we have, on Papua New Guinea, Australia, and New Zealand, we have a differences or power sharing between the central government and the provinces. Okay? And you will see in Papua New Guinea as well, because the governors are now complaining about this issue here. The central government should decentralize powers to the provinces. Okay? So this classification of government, the government can be seen as whether, the relationship of the government can be seen through whether the state has more power in centralizing its authority over the state, or the state as decentralized, meaning that moving powers away to the provinces. Okay? So Hansen and Harab's three classification in government, okay, to these three notions here. One is the relationship between the state and the society. I like this one. Second is the relationship between the executive and the legislature. Highlight this one importantly. And third is the relationship between centralization and decentralization. Okay, so let's look at an example before we move on. Let's say a conflict. If the state and let's look at state and society relationship. Okay, when the government passes the Terrorism Act, okay, the recent anti-terrorism laws, okay, the conflict is that people were not happy about that law, and they eventually led to the banning of Facebook. When people are starting to question the state overarching of their use of power over, okay, over its executive or over that bill, if you look at Aristotle's classification, when people are not happy, then we are saying that the government is, okay, encroaching on its citizen, and that leadership tends to be perverted, okay, bad leadership. People are crying out for that or against the government. So you look at that type of, okay, typology here in Hansen and Harab's view. If the state is doing well, then that is a genuine type of leadership from the state, or genuine rulership. Okay? If it's not doing well, then the relationship between the state and the society is being perverted. If it's doing well, then the relationship is a genuine relationship. Now let's take a look in another example between the executive and the legislature. If in Papua New Guinea Parliament, the opposition is crying out loud for the executive not following due processes, as in the Section 145 motion or the recent parliamentary sitting, when the opposition needs to run to the court, then there is a conflict within the relationship between the executive arm and the legislature. So in that kind of issue, or the recent challenges or the court recalling of the parliament, then you may view that the executive is the executive is now having to use insurmountable power over the legislature. So the relationship there is not genuine, and it's perverted according to Aristotle's classification. So you can look at the power conflict or relationship between the executive government and the legislature, depending on whether it's a prime minister or Westminster system or a presidential system. Now the third is the classification between centralization and decentralization. A good conflict in Papua New Guinea is that the governors are now calling up on autonomy for Bougainville, for New Guinea Islands, because they are saying that the executive government is overwhelmingly withholding or having more use of power at the center, or the centralization of power is within the executive government. And then the provinces are calling out for decentralization of those powers. So you can see the conflicts here tends to be between the idea of centralization and decentralization. So that is Hansen and Harab's view on the types or the classification in as far as politics is concerned. So moving away from the classification formally by on the basis of modernization, the first world, second world, and then later developed and the underdeveloped. So now let's move on to another classification, and that is the political regimes of the modern world. Now you will, a detailed explanation of it is found in your reading 7 by Awood, 1997, okay? So he outlines the 5 types of political system that can be identified in the modern world. So we are looking at classification from the Aristotle's view. So from Aristotle's view, he looks at classification in an individual aspect on who rules and who benefits. And then we looked at Hansen and Harab's view. Hansen and Harab's view, he looks at classification, okay, looking at the systems of government. Now we are moving from systems within the government, okay, into a broader, the types of political system. Now there are, let me see, how many types of political systems here, mentioned here. There are about 5 types, okay? Now let's say if you want to read about a country or study a country, you can use these 5 classifications to see where the country, okay, how the country operates, which ideology you can say, or you can see why a particular country is acting in such a way, okay, that is against the values and beliefs of another country. So all this can be analyzed through these types of political system. Okay, so number 1 we have the Western polyarchies. Now the Western polyarchies, they are characterized by a relatively high tolerance of political opposition and wide-ranging opportunities for general population to participate in the political process. Okay, and I'll read. Polyarchy can be understood, okay, polyarchy can be understood as an approximation of democracy, and that system operates through institutions that force rulers to take account of interest and wishes of the electorate. Western polyarchies are also characterized by the widespread acceptance of Western liberalism and their shared Western cultural, philosophical, and religious tradition. Some examples of Western polyarchies include Australia, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Switzerland, and the United States. Now let's look at or try and analyze this paragraph here. First of all, highlight the first sentence here, especially this. In Western polyarchy system, you would find there is high tolerance of political opposition. Okay, this is in regards to, let's say, free speech, freedom of association. So there is high tolerance of political opposition, meaning that in any democratic or Western polyarchy country, you would see that there are opposition views towards the rulership or the government. And that is a norm, meaning that you would commonly find opposing views in those countries. And another important view here is that if you look at, let's see, first sentence, second sentence here. Polarchy can be understood as an approximation of democracy in that system operates through institutions that forces rulers to take account of interests and wishes of the electorate. So in most Western polarchy systems, okay, or you can say democracies, they operate in such a way that institutions give effect to the way, okay, the rulers rule. And these rulers must take account of their rulership or leadership. So you would find in Western polarchy countries is commonly associated to those democratic countries, Australia, New Zealand, even Papua New Guinea as well. Okay? The fact that you have the right to criticize your government, okay, you can be categorized under a Western polarchy system. Okay? Now the next system, okay, or the next political system here is the post-communist regimes. I think that is pretty much straightforward. So the post-communist regimes are former communist regimes that are undergoing a process of democratization and market liberalization that draws heavily upon the ideology of Western liberalization. So formerly, these countries were under communist or communism leadership, notably those countries in the Eastern European part of the world. So after the Berlin Wall, the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989, most of these Eastern European countries, okay, started to go through a process of democratization. Okay? So most of these countries now, you have Ukraine today is a democratic country, formerly known as or part of these post-communist regimes. Okay? And the reason why there is conflict here, because formerly Ukraine and other countries, okay, around that region, Eastern European countries, were formerly part of the communist Russia. So this classification might change today, or in a way they exist a small number of Eastern European countries that existed today. But the classification of that can be categorized under post-communist countries. So post-communist countries are countries that, okay, were part of the communist, let's say, rulership, administration, or part of communist Russia, and are in the process of democratization. Okay, in the process of going towards embracing and accepting ideals and values of democracy. And then you have the East Asian regimes. Now the East Asian regimes are countries that tend to share similar characteristics that differentiate them from Western regimes. East Asian regimes are oriented more around economic development rather than political objectives such as individual freedom. Okay? And I'll explain a bit further on this. The communist China is different from communist Russia. In East Asian regimes, okay, basically East Asian regime talks about countries in the East Asia. Now, countries in the East Asia, such as China, China is not ideologically, or the Chinese Communist Party does not sway ideologically to the communist doctrine, where Russia tends to fall in. China's communist ideology is more shaped up by Asian values. And that Asian values is rooted, okay, around economic development and political objectives. Okay? So you will find in China, Japan, North and South Korea, more or less Thailand, Taiwan, Malaysia, okay, to a certain extent, they are countries that more or less more about, or countries that falls into the Confucius philosophy or teaching or ideas. So they are more rooted into political and development objectives rather than ideological objectives or the ideological roots of communism. The ideological roots of communism came from the Karl Marx's view of Marxism. Okay? Okay, and I'll read. So other characteristics include support for strong government, emphasis on community and social cohesion, and general disposition to respect leaders because of the Confucius stress on loyalty, discipline, and duty. So you would find that Chinese people, or even in North Korea, they tend to respect and show loyalty to their rulers, okay? Because it is part of their culture. The Confucius teaching or the Confucius values or the Confucius doctrines emphasize more on respect to authority, okay, over everything else, or loyalty over everything else. Okay, so that is why Chinese Communist Party or Chinese communism is different from Russian or USSR communism. Chinese communism is more geared towards the Confucius teaching, which is rooted in political and development aspects rather than ideological. Okay, let's move on. Number 4 is you have Islamic regimes. Now, Islamic regimes are grounded in Islam, okay, the religion of Islam. And I'll read, Islamic regimes are grounded in Islam, which is not simply a religion, but a way of life that defines correct moral, political, and economic behavior for individuals and nations alike. So in Islamic regimes, you can say the country is sort of administered through the Sharia law or the Islam laws, values, and teachings. Second sentence, political Islam aims at the construction of a theoretical or theocracy, which is a regime where government posts are filled on the basis of peasants' position in the religious hierarchy. In any theocracy, the position of the government position is assigned to them by their level of position in the religious hierarchy. So, if a Christian country like Papua New Guinea, okay, if you are to become a theocracy, country that abides under Christian principle, then you would say that all the executive government will be formed by pastors, area leaders, priests, okay? So the position of authority in those countries is defined by, okay, the level of hierarchy in terms of their position in the religion, okay, Islam. So you have the highest authority would be given to, not sure how to call this, pastor in equivalent sense in the Islamic religion. Okay. So in countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Sudan, these are countries that more or less have their constitution, political system that is derived from the Islamic religion. Okay. You will commonly find these countries in the Middle East. And lastly, number 5 is the military regimes. Okay, so military regimes are political systems where the leaders posts in the government are filled on the basis of peasants' position within the military chain of command. if in the Islamic region the position is based on their hierarchy or the importance of this according to the Islamic law, then in a military regime, the government post is filled by the rank and file. Okay? So you would see in a dictatorial or totalitarian regimes, usually a military regime, the position is being filled by rank and file in the force. Example, Fiji was one time under a military regime by under former commander Baini Marama, I believe. Okay. And what is this country in Africa? Burkina Faso under Traore. It's something like that. This is an example of a country under military, or the type of system, okay? A country under the military regime, sorry. Okay, so what we have here, we've talked about, so now you will know that if the head of a country, the chief ruler of a country, if he's in a military attire and addressing the conference or the media, or addressing the media, then you automatically know that that country is under the classification of a military regime. If you see, let's say, I forgot Saudi Arabia's leader, bin Salman. Okay, if you see him, you will see that when he goes for international leadership summit around the world, you will see him in a traditional Islamic attire. You will know that the country, Saudi Arabia, falls under the typology of an Islamic regime. Okay. So here you can use these types of the 5 basic regimes or typology to see the kind of country, society, okay, a country belongs to. Okay. Okay, so as a way of summary, we've looked at Aristotle's classification. Now, all in all, if you look at the modern types of regimes, if you look at Hansen and Harab's typology, you will see that at the very heart of these types of political system, it comes back to Aristotle's view of who rules and who benefits. Okay? Now, that dimension of who rules and who benefits tend to, okay, over the years have been classified into all lenses. Okay? Looking into the relationship between executive and the legislature, the presidential and the Congress, or even the types of countries that existed. But at the heart of the types of classification, that there exist these 2 dimensions here: who rules and who benefits. For example, we would like to portray that in a Western polarchy country, we tend to see a genuine leadership, whereas in a military, Islamic, and let's say to a certain extent East Asian post-communist regime, the leadership tends to be perverted in some sort. If you look at the Aristotle's classification in Papua New Guinea's sense, if you look at the dominance of the executive government, then Aristotle would say that Papua New Guinea is moving from a genuine leadership to a perverted type of leadership. So that goes back to the very foundation or principle on power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Okay? So with that, I'll conclude Okay, let me just go through the summary before I finish. I'll just read the summary. Okay, so this unit examines some of the main ways of classifying political systems. We begin with the examination of classical typology developed by Aristotle. Okay, so now you know the classical typology developed by Aristotle. If I ask a question in the exam, then the classical typology refers to two dimensions. These two dimensions are who rules and who benefits. However, okay, and I'll read, however, while the system is still influential, the development of modern constitutional government has meant that such classical typology are increasingly inadequate. That is why Hansen and Harab decided to develop their own typology of classifying political system. Okay? So to address this inadequacy, we introduce a contemporary classification system based on three components. And these three components are the relationship between the state and society, the degree of decentralization and centralization, or centralization and decentralization, and the relationship between executive and the legislature. Okay? And then we concluded by outlining the 5 types of political system that can be identified in the modern world. Okay? So that concludes our discussion on Unit 7. So we are on track. Okay?